In the quiet corners of Louisville, Kentucky, long before the world would chant his name, there was a young boy with bright eyes and restless hands. His name was Cassius Marcellus Clay, Jr. He didn't come from riches or from royalty. His father painted signs and billboards for a living. His mother worked cleaning houses, and their home stood in the segregated South, a place where the air was thick with dreams that were not always meant to come true for boys like him. Yet even then, there was something different about Cassius. He carried an energy, a spark, like a storm waiting for thunder to answer its call. He talked fast, laughed loud, and moved as if his body already knew it was born to dance inside a boxing ring. One humid summer evening, when he was only 12, something happened that would change everything. His bicycle, a red Schwinn, shiny and new, was stolen outside a local auditorium. For a boy his age, that bike was more than metal and paint. It was freedom, pride, and the thrill of feeling wind race past his face. He stormed into the building, eyes wide with anger, demanding justice from anyone who would listen. "I'm gonna whoop whoever took my bike," he shouted to a man sitting nearby, who happened to be a police officer named Joe Martin. The officer looked at him with a patient kind of amusement and said, "You better learn to fight before you start making threats like that." Those words sank deep into the boy's mind. That was the moment Cassius Clay decided to become a boxer. Not to hurt, but to defend. Not to destroy, but to reclaim what was his. Joe Martin became his first trainer, taking him under his wing at a small gym in Louisville's Columbia Auditorium. The room smelled of sweat and old gloves. The floor creaked, and the mirrors were cracked at the edges. But for Cassius, it was sacred ground. He moved with a rhythm that was almost musical, his punches sharp yet graceful, like a dancer learning the language of survival. He trained relentlessly, shadow boxing with invisible opponents, whispering to himself words of power. "I am the greatest," though few believed him then. What started as childish bravado soon grew into a prophecy he would live to fulfill. At home, his mother, Odessa, prayed for him every night, asking God to protect her boy from the world's cruelty. His father, Cassius Sr., proud but wary, warned him about the limits the world placed on black men. Yet, the boy refused to see limits. He looked into the mirror and saw not the narrow confines of Louisville's segregated streets, but a future where his name echoed beyond America. He dreamed of greatness before he even understood what it meant. And maybe that was the secret. He believed before anyone else could. By the time he turned 16, Cassius had become a local sensation. His fists were quick, his feet even quicker. He fought with a style that confused older boxers, light on his toes, gliding across the ring, taunting his opponents, slipping punches with an almost supernatural ease. He fought like someone who saw everything before it happened. He didn't just throw punches, he performed poetry with his body, and behind every swing was a smile, a flash of confidence that said, "You can't catch me." Louisville began to whisper his name. Soon, America would shout it. In 1960, when the world gathered for the Rome Olympics, Cassius Clay was there, a young man from Kentucky, carrying the weight of his country on his shoulders and the pride of his people in his heart. He was tall, handsome, and impossibly charming. His teammates called him the Talker because he never stopped speaking his mind, predicting his victories before the bell even rang. "To beat me, you got to be fast," he'd say, "and you can't hit what you can't see." In Rome, under the Italian sun, his words turned into truth. He moved through opponents like a breeze through leaves, untouched, untamed, unstoppable. In the final bout, he danced circles around Zbigniew Pietrzykowski of Poland, winning gold for the United States. When they placed the medal around his neck, he smiled like a man who had glimpsed destiny. But destiny, he would learn, is never a straight path. When he returned to Louisville, he found that a gold medal did not make him equal in the eyes of America. One night, after being refused the service at a segregated restaurant, he threw that Olympic medal into the Ohio River. It was not an act of anger, but of awakening. The boy who once fought to reclaim a stolen bicycle now began to see that there were larger injustices to fight, ones that no glove or gold could mend. Inside him, something shifted. Cassius Clay, the talkative boy from Louisville, was beginning to listen to a deeper voice, one that spoke of identity, dignity, and freedom. As he turned professional, his confidence became legend. He would predict the round. His opponents would fall in, then make it happen. Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, he said, and the world listened. His tongue was as sharp as his jab, his humor as quick as his footwork. Yet behind the charisma was discipline. Every morning he ran before dawn, breathing in the cold Kentucky air. He trained harder than anyone, his sweat becoming the ink with which he wrote his destiny. When he fought, it wasn't just sport. It was theater, philosophy, rebellion, and art. He made boxing beautiful. Then came the night of February 25th, 1964. Miami Beach. The air was heavy with expectation. Cassius Clay, just 22 years old, was facing Sonny Liston, the fearsome heavyweight champion, a man many thought unbeatable. The odds were against him. The press called him cocky, foolish, a clown. But as the cameras flashed, Clay smiled that same unshakable smile. The bell rang, and he danced. Round after round, he moved with a rhythm that made Liston look slow, almost ancient. His gloves flashed like lightning, his voice echoing between breaths. You can't hit what you can't see. By the 7th round, Liston didn't come out of his corner. Cassius Clay had done the impossible. The world had a new heavyweight champion. In that moment, under the blinding lights, he shouted to the reporters who had doubted him, "I am the greatest. I shook up the world." And indeed, he had. But it was not just the world of sports he would shake. It was the world of politics, of race, of faith. Because that same night, after the cheers began to fade, Cassius Clay whispered to the world something that would change everything. He was no longer Cassius Clay. He was Muhammad Ali, a name given to him by Elijah Muhammad of the Nation of Islam, a name that meant beloved of God, a name that carried the weight of rebirth. The announcement sent shockwaves through America. To some, he was a hero who stood for pride and identity. To others, a traitor who had turned his back on his country's traditions. Yet, Ali stood firm. Cassius Clay was my slave name, he said quietly. I didn't choose it. I am Muhammad Ali now, free and proud. The boy who once fought for a stolen bicycle had become a man fighting for his soul. As the months passed, his faith deepened and his defiance grew. The world saw his confidence as arrogance, but those who looked closer saw courage. The courage to be himself in a world that demanded submission. He spoke against injustice, against the Vietnam War, against the idea that a man should kill for a country that denied him equality. But that part of his story, the battle outside the ring, was only beginning. Because soon, Muhammad Ali would find himself fighting not for belts or titles, but for the right to be who he was. They say that sometimes history chooses its heroes not for their victories, but for the moments when they refuse to bow. For Muhammad Ali, that moment came not under the bright lights of the boxing ring, but in the silent echo of a decision that would shake the conscience of a nation. It was 1967, and America was caught in the fever of war. Young men were being drafted, sent across oceans to fight in jungles they had never heard of, against people they did not know. And somewhere in the heart of Louisville's most famous son, a different kind of war was taking shape. One that would not be fought with fists or weapons, but with conviction. When the draft notice came, Muhammad Ali looked at it long and hard, as though it were more than paper, as though it carried a question only his soul could answer. The world expected him to go. His government expected him to go. Even some who admired him thought he had no choice, but Ali had already made a choice long before that letter arrived. He had joined the Nation of Islam. He had shed the name Cassius Clay, a name he called his slave name, and in its place, he had taken one that meant something sacred. Muhammad Ali, beloved of God. To him, that faith was more than religion. It was purpose. It was a mirror in which he saw himself clearly for the first time. And now, that clarity demanded something of him, a stand. So when the reporters gathered, when the microphones pointed toward him like 1,000 unblinking eyes, he said words that still linger like thunder across time. I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong. No Viet Cong ever called me nigger. It was a simple statement, but in its simplicity, it carried an earthquake. The son of America was calling out its contradictions. A black man asked to die for freedom abroad when he was still denied dignity at home. The air around him grew colder after that. The same commentators who once called him the greatest began calling him a coward. The press, the politicians, even fellow athletes, many turned their backs. When he refused to step forward during his draft call, the room went silent. Cameras flashed. A marshal stepped closer, warning him that his refusal was against the law. But Ali's body stayed still, his jaw set in quiet defiance. That single act, that stillness, became one of the loudest moments in 20th century history. In that silence, he lost everything that had built his legend. His heavyweight title was stripped, his license to box revoked. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison and a fine $10,000. The man who once floated like a butterfly now stood grounded, wings clipped by the government of the country he had made proud. But Ali was never just a boxer. He was a mirror of his time, and his time was a storm of change. The civil rights movement was roaring across America. Malcolm X had already been assassinated. Dr. King was marching, speaking, pleading for justice. And here was Ali, once dismissed as just an athlete, now standing shoulder to shoulder with the movement's moral giants, not through marches or speeches, but through sacrifice. Every day he was banned, every fight he missed, became a statement carved into the conscience of the nation, that no man's worth is determined by obedience, but by integrity. He began to travel, to speak, to lend his voice to the voiceless. University campuses filled with young people, tired of war, hungry for truth, invited him to talk. They expected anger. Instead, they got grace. My fight, he would say softly, is not against men. My fight is against the system that tells me I must hate when I choose peace. And in those whispers of defiance, he became something more than a champion. He became a teacher, prophet in his own right. His faith was tested. The Nation of Islam, which had once embraced him, now watched him from a distance as he walked his path alone. The loss of Malcolm X, his friend, his brother, still haunted him. He had broken with Malcolm before his assassination, believing the rumors and politics that divided them, but in the quiet moments of exile, when the roar of the crowd was gone, Ali replayed those memories, the conversations, the laughter, the warnings. He began to understand what Malcolm had been trying to tell him, that faith and justice are not separate, that courage is not in the fist, but in the choice to stand for what is right, even when no one stands beside you. For 3 long years, Ali was kept out of the ring. 3 years when his prime was slipping through his fingers. 3 years when the world moved on without him. Or so they thought, but every time his name appeared in print, it wasn't in the sports section. It was on the front page. The young black generation looked at him and saw a man who refused to kneel to injustice, a man who paid for his beliefs in the only currency that mattered, everything he had. And in time, the tide began to turn. America was changing. The war that once seemed righteous now looked endless and senseless. The same voices that called him unpatriotic began to question the cost of that patriotism when the Supreme Court overturned his conviction in 1971. It wasn't just a legal victory, it was a moral one. Ali walked free not just as a man, but as a symbol of endurance, of what it means to stand unbroken in a world determined to bend you. When he returned to the ring, it wasn't just for glory. It was to prove that no power, not the state, not the press, not time itself, could silence his spirit. But something had shifted in him. The brash young fighter who once boasted of being the greatest now carried something gentler in his eyes. His words, though still sharp, carried weight born from pain. He spoke less of knocking men down and more of lifting people up. He had been stripped of his crown, and in losing it, had found something far more enduring, a purpose that would outlast any championship. Through the 70s, as he fought titans like Joe Frazier and George Foreman, those fights were no longer just about boxing. They were metaphors for survival, for the fight of the human spirit. When he stood in Zaire for the rumble in the jungle, facing a man younger, stronger, and feared, he whispered to his team, "This one is for all those who were told they can't." That night, when he leaned against the ropes and let Foreman punch himself into exhaustion, it wasn't just strategy, it was symbolism. The old champion taking every blow the world could throw at him, and still standing, smiling, whispering, "Is that all you got?" And when he finally knocked Foreman down, it wasn't victory that filled his eyes. It was peace. Because for Ali, the real victory had already been won years before, in that quiet courtroom where he refused to betray his conscience. By the time the cheers died down, Muhammad Ali had become something the world had never seen before. A man whose greatest fight was not against opponents, but against injustice itself. And that fight continued long after the lights dimmed. He spoke out against apartheid in South Africa. He visited refugee camps, bringing food and medicine. He met with world leaders and children alike, always with that same message, that courage is not born in power but in compassion. Even when Parkinson's disease began to steal his movement and his voice, the quiet strength that had defined him only grew stronger. In his stillness, people saw the same defiance that once stood before the draft board. His tremors did not shake his dignity. His silences spoke louder than any speech. And when he lit the Olympic torch in 1996, hands trembling but heart steady, the world wept, not just for the champion he once was, but for the man he had become. A living reminder that greatness is not measured in strength, but in the willingness to rise again, again, and again. Ali's life became a circle. From the boy who dreamed in Louisville to the man who taught the world how to stand. His politics were never about parties or positions. They were about people, about justice, about faith. He had once refused to go to war, and now his very existence had become a quiet war for peace. One he fought not with punches, but with presence. And in those final years, when words became hard to form, people would sit with him and watch as he smiled. That same mischievous smile that once taunted opponents in the ring. It was as if he was still whispering to the world, still reminding us all of something simple yet eternal. That no one can take your spirit unless you hand it to them. That silence can be stronger than noise. That even when your voice trembles, you can still speak truth. He once said, "Service to others is the rent you pay for your room here on earth." And perhaps that was the creed of his life. That the measure of a man lies not in what he wins, but in what he gives back. As the years went on and his body slowed, the world around him seemed to speed up. Wars, politics, chaos. Yet whenever his image appeared, people paused, because in that face they saw not just a boxer, but a bridge between courage and compassion. A man who refused to fight others so he could fight for peace. And when the whisper of his life finally began to fade, it did not end. It echoed through every act of resistance, through every young voice that says no to injustice, through every believer who stands their ground quietly, firmly, with faith. Because Muhammad Ali did not just change the world inside the ring. He changed what it meant to be a fighter. He showed us that sometimes the greatest battle is not fought before a crowd, but before your own conscience. And that to stand firm, even when the whole world tells you to kneel, is the bravest act of all. There comes a time when even the loudest hearts begin to speak in silence. For Muhammad Ali, that silence came not as surrender, but as serenity. The world had seen him roar, had heard him proclaim himself the greatest, had watched him defy governments, opponents, and the chains of expectation. But now, as the years passed and his body began to betray him, his greatness transformed. It no longer lived in his fists or his words. It lived in the gentle stillness of a man who had nothing left to prove. Parkinson's disease came like a slow dawn, uninvited but unstoppable. The tremors, the stiffness, the fading voice. It was as if time itself was asking him to fight one last opponent, one he could never defeat with strength alone. Yet even then, Ali did not see it as punishment. He saw it as a test. God, he would say softly, gave me this to remind me that I am not the greatest. He is. That humility, that surrender of ego, was perhaps his final act of courage. The man who once danced before the world now learned to sit still, to listen, to reflect. Those who visited him in those later years spoke of a quiet presence that filled the room. There was no bitterness, no complaint, only that soft, knowing smile. Sometimes, when his hands trembled too much to hold a glass, he would joke, "Even now, I'm still shaking up the world." But beneath the humor was acceptance, a peace born not from victory, but from understanding. He had spent his life defying everything: racism, politics, war, disease. And yet, in the end, he found power in surrender. not the surrender of giving up, but of giving in to grace. He began to travel less, but his influence reached farther than ever. He supported humanitarian missions, sent aid to war-torn countries, spoke for those who had no voice. His illness slowed him, but it could not silence him. Every appearance, no matter how brief, carried the weight of history. When he lit the Olympic torch in Atlanta in 1996, the stadium went still. The flame flickered in his trembling hand, and for a moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't just a symbol of sport. It was a symbol of endurance, of how light can tremble and still burn bright. People began to see Ali not as the boxer, but as the bridge he had become. Between faiths, between nations, between races. He had once been divisive, a figure of controversy and rebellion. Now, he was unity itself. The same man who refused to go to war now stood for peace in every corner of the globe. Presidents, kings, children, they all came to meet him, and each one left changed, touched by something that no photograph or speech could capture. It was the quiet glow of a man who had faced everything and still chosen kindness. In his later interviews, when words came slow and soft, you could hear the depth of his reflection. I used to think boxing was the greatest thing, he said once, his voice barely above a whisper. But now I know that life is about helping others. That's what makes you truly great. Those words carried the wisdom of a man who had seen both fame and exile, victory and loss, and found peace not in what he had achieved, but in what he had endured. He often spoke of heaven, not as a distant place, but as something we build through the good we do. The best of people, he whispered once to a young visitor, are those who do good for others. And perhaps that was the secret that time had been waiting for him to share. That greatness is not in how high you rise, but in how gently you lift others when you fall. The years went on. His body grew frail. His voice faded until it was little more than breath. But even in that stillness, he seemed to be speaking. Every gesture, every glance carried meaning. He became a kind of living poem, a reminder that strength and softness are not opposites, but reflections of one another. His home in Arizona was quiet, often filled with the family, laughter, and the scent of home-cooked meals. Children ran through the halls, unaware that the man sitting in the corner had once shaken the world. To them, he was simply Grandpa Ali, gentle, patient, always smiling. Sometimes he would watch the sunset and whisper lines from the Quran, his lips moving silently. He found comfort in faith, in the idea that life was never about perfection, but about purpose. He believed that everything, every triumph, every loss, every trembling hand, was part of a divine plan. And that belief gave him peace. Even as his body weakened, his spirit seemed to grow lighter, as if preparing for a journey he no longer feared. When he passed away in June 2016, the world fell silent once again. Crowds gathered, streets filled. From Louisville to Lagos, from Mecca to Manila, people mourned not just a legend, but a teacher. The funeral was a global moment, a river of humanity flowing in gratitude. Muslims prayed, Christians wept, children held signs that read the greatest. But among the tears, there was something else, a quiet understanding that this man who once called himself the greatest had spent his life teaching the world what true greatness meant. His words echoed through time. He who is not courageous enough to take risks will accomplish nothing in life. And yet, Perhaps the greatest risk he ever took was to love people who did not always love him back, to forgive a country that once turned its back on him, to believe in peace when the world demanded war. In that way, Muhammad Ali's legacy is not bound by the past. It lives wherever someone stands firm in their beliefs, wherever someone refuses to bow to injustice, wherever someone chooses love over hate. His story is not a chapter of history. It's a whisper that still moves through the air, reminding us that courage does not always shout. Sometimes it simply breathes. And maybe that's how he would want to be remembered, not as the man who could knock giants down, but as the man who lifted the world up through the sheer force of his heart. When the lights go down and his name is spoken in a whisper, you can almost hear him again, that soft, teasing voice filled with life and laughter. I told you I was the greatest, but what I really meant was that you could be too. And the whisper fades, carried by the wind, still